No, as John says, I'm currently at Oxford, and one of the things I'm also doing at Oxford is working in a new centre there called the Wellcome Centre for Ethics and Humanities, which also looks at medical interventions and international interventions in times of crisis. And this topic falls quite neatly into that. It's a new area that we're looking at. But as John says, this evening, what I'm going to do is talk about the Great Fire of Thessaloniki, this enormous conflagration, the most destructive urban fire in modern Greek history, which occurred, as John says, 100 years ago. So within a period of 32 hours, it destroyed 3/4 of the old city, over 120 hectares of urban space, 9,500 buildings, homes, shops, factories, warehouses, synagogues, churches, hotels, restaurants, and also made over 70,000 people homeless. And just to set the scene, further, this photograph that I'm showing you here was taken on the night of the fire. The fire had broken out that afternoon and shows the city skyline silhouetted against the smoke and the flame. This one gives you an idea of the scale of devastation as well, the scale of destruction. It's a British map, and as you can see, it takes up most of the inner city. These are the city walls up here and around there, and this is obviously the area that was burned. Just to give you very briefly, brief summary of the fire itself. So the fire broke out in a house on the northwest corner of the city, so somewhere around about here. And then really contributing to that was the very dry weather. This was August, of course. The fact that the houses were chiefly made of wood and very closely packed together. But above all, the strong Vardar wind, which was an onshore wind, and pretty much, first of all, fanned the flames in an easterly direction towards the White Tower, which you can see just here. And then, after several hours, the wind changed and pushed the flames in a southerly direction and forced the destruction all the way up to the water's edge, so taking all this area as well. This gives you some idea, just a quick glimpse of the sort of devastation that there was. Now, the fire, as you'd expect, occupies an important, very important place in the modern history of Thessaloniki. The death toll was felt to have been tiny, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the fire had an enormous impact on society, culture, economics of the city, and of course on the architecture. So the new city that you see in Thessaloniki today is built on the ruins of this and to a completely different layout. Now, all of these developments, these impacts, have become themes in the historiography of the fire. That's the way that history is written about it, the narratives constructed around it. But this evening I'm going to talk about something a little different. So more specifically, I'm going to talk about how the fire really from the perspective of British soldiers, sailors, civilians who were in the city at the time, who witnessed it, who experienced it really, and also who responded to it in various ways. And the main ways that I'm going to talk about are fighting the fire, first of all, but then also the evacuation, the protection, and the feeding of the refugees from the fire, those left homeless. And as I go along, I'm going to be drawing on accounts written at the time. So that's diaries, letters, and official military documents, which you can find in British archives. And I'm also going to show you various images, photographs, but also later on some artwork, which were really, you can consider a surviving element of the British response, if you like, because these were records made deliberately of the fire, and sometimes these are actually official records of the fire. And overall, hopefully, I'll give you a more nuanced impression, really, of these forms of intervention, these forms of response, and suggest, I think, something of how being seen to respond sensitively and compassionately and in a timely manner can impact positively on a local population. But I'll start by quickly sketching out for you briefly how the British came to be in Thessaloniki in the first place. What were they doing there in 1917? So the fire took place, as John said, at the height of the First World War, when Salonika, as the British called it, was home not only to the city's established population, but also thousands of refugees and tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. These soldiers were mainly British, French, and Greek by this time, but they also included Italians, Russians, Serbs as well, and they were all in Macedonia to fight mainly Bulgar forces on battlefields north of the city, Bulgaria being aligned with Germany at that point. Thessaloniki was the main hub of transport for that front. It was the main base for these Allied armies. It was the main transport point for men and supplies coming into the city and going out. It was where all the armies had their main headquarters. It was where they had most of their hospitals. In fact, it's important to acknowledge that in August 1917, when the fire takes place, it's not just the British who respond to it. The French in particular were involved. In fact, the French were supposed to be in charge of coordinating most of the response by the Allied armies to the fire. But I think it's fair to say that of all these armies, the actions of British forces are generally considered to have been the most significant in terms of the scale and impact of their contribution. And one way in which the British forces tried to help was by actively trying to fight the fire. Okay, so this is an image taken shortly after the fire of where they felt the fire began, in the northwest corner of the old city. Now today it's felt that the fire started here at around 2:30 on the afternoon of the 18th of August 1917. And at the time there were various conspiracy theories about what had caused it. There was an idea that German agents had perhaps started it deliberately. There were stories that someone had started it deliberately so that they could claim from insurance companies, claim insurance payouts. But all the evidence today really points to an ordinary kitchen fire that then spread, helped by the wind, as I said, and the highly inflammable construction of so many houses, and the absence of an adequate municipal fire brigade. And all of this is underlined by a report, which I'm going to quote here really because I found it recently in British archives and I don't think it's come to light before. It's a report by a French investigating officer who was sent deliberately to try to establish what had caused the fire. And he goes and interviews various people. This is only 3 days after the fire. And he traces the cause to a house in number 3 Olympiados Street in northern Thessaloniki. And he finds that 2 women who were both refugees had been preparing food on a stove above a basement in which very dry feed was being kept for feeding horses. And then he writes this, and I'll quote from his report. It would seem that the oil, which was left too long on the heat, had spontaneously caught fire and spread over the feed. The 2 frightened women, instead of thinking to smother the fire, went out into the street and called out to help. A passer-by, who was known in the neighbourhood and is apparently a certain Halil Bey, a Serbian, was the only person in the crowd who entered the house and used all the water he was able to find. He tried in vain to convince the neighbours to bring him some containers of water. Halil Bey, when interviewed, declared that at the moment of his intervention, 2 buckets worth of water would have been sufficient to prevent the catastrophe. No one thought to bring him the least bit of help, however. When the ceiling of the first floor caught fire and smoke started to come out of the windows, the neighbourhood had only one thought: to pack their bags and to withdraw to a safe distance. It was then around 3 p.m. He then describes how a local fire pump manned by Greek and Jewish volunteers turns up, but they can't do anything. It's a very old wooden hand pump, and there are problems with water. And then the gendarmerie appear and say that it's going to be too much the fire already is too much to deal with. And then by about 5:30 in the afternoon, he finishes his report saying, by that point, the extent of the fire and the intensity of the wind unfortunately made all efforts useless. Now, it's widely appreciated today that the fire was pretty much unstoppable by that point and could not have been prevented by even a modern fire engine. This is the sort of fire engine that had traditionally been in Thessaloniki until very shortly before the fire. It's a very old-fashioned hand pump. It was the same sort of thing used by Jewish and Greek volunteer fire brigades scattered around the city. However, on the eve of the fire, the British seem to have, on the fire they do their best, and they actually landed 2 brand new cutting-edge fire engines on the eve of the fire, and these were purpose-built, British-built, manufactured by Dennis, which is a company in Surrey in England. This is one of them at work, very different from what you see in that previous slide. This is modern technology at work, really the most modern technology as far as firefighting technology is concerned. So when the fire is at its worst, one of these engines is positioned 200 yards from the White Tower and works without stopping for a day and a half, actually, and the crews work non-stop to keep the fire from spreading further. Then alongside the second fire engine, this engine as well is employed down by the port side, by the water side, to prevent the fire spreading all the way to the quayside and the port, which of course is very important for all sorts of reasons. And they work to try to keep the fire away from that. And these are the two fire engines side by side 3 days after the fire broke out, down by the quayside, working together. Now, did these sorts of efforts actually work? So later, one British officer who was also the editor of the Balkan News, which was a newspaper really, that the British produced for the whole of Macedonia for readership by British troops. He wrote in the newspaper that the work of these fire engines was no more than a man shaking his fist at the fire. So he had a very dim view of, or very limited. He felt that their impact was very limited, of course. But in a report written at the time, the officer in charge of one of these fire engines, a chap called Lieutenant Thomas Woolley, was convinced that his engine's efforts had helped to stop the fire pressing all the way to the White Tower, and had later saved the French headquarters, which was on the docksides, and other vital buildings in that area. Both fire engines spent another week, in fact, in the ruins of the city, putting out smaller fires, which was also very important work. In many modern accounts of the fire itself, you find the fire described as lasting 32 hours, but that was chiefly the period it took to get the fire under control. And it's clear from British documents that, in fact, the fire took another 10 days really to put out. One British officer who took part in controlling these smaller fires was a young officer called Lieutenant Raymond Preece. He was just 19 years old at the time and had just arrived in Thessaloniki a few days before. He kept a diary, which is now in the Imperial War Museum, and he wrote in his diary that he played a very humble role, as he put it, pouring seawater onto the smoking ruins. But it's clear from his diary that he did a bit more than that, and that the work itself was still exhausting and extremely dangerous. So he writes this in his diary. On one occasion, one French soldier lay dead at my feet, and another, buried 20 feet below in burning rubble, called on his God. Not in vain, for as he called, the ruin collapsed, and the voice was silent. But for the most part, the work lay amid scenes of desolation and despair, and the leaden-footed hours dragged slowly. Wet with sweat and water, smothered in ashes and the reek of burning oil, praying only for rest and sleep, we all grew hollow-cheeked and red of eye. Afterwards, even in our tumbled sleep, we still dragged the hoses about, and twice I woke, crying insults and exhortation, encouragement and blame to an imaginary working party. Now, Preece's diary is especially interesting because it's a rare description of casualties, in this case 2 French soldiers. Very few published histories say anything at all on the topic of the dead, except for insisting that the death toll was very small. But in the accounts of British soldiers who were in the city as it burned, and who worked in the deserted ruins afterwards when there was no one else really to see these things, you can find more detail. For example, one soldier wrote home of coming across, as he wrote, dead dogs, cats and donkeys, and occasionally charred remains of human beings. The British were not only involved in trying to fight the fire, they also played important roles in evacuating the city and providing relief to those left homeless. Now, many British documents, letters, diaries, contain powerful descriptions of people fleeing the fire, the plight really of those who suddenly find themselves homeless. For example, a Scottish officer wrote home to Dundee of scenes that were, as he wrote, heartrending beyond description. And this is what he wrote. People just getting out of their homes at the last possible moment and desperate to save their belongings, women demented, children losing their parents, and everything chaos. Can you at home imagine 2 miles square, one solid mass of red, lurid flame, and people's homes being wrecked under those flames? Can you imagine 100,000 inhabitants frantically removing their household goods, and then the streets crowded with these panic-stricken people and littered with property? A soldier in the Royal Army Medical Corps who was assigned to helping people get out of their houses wrote in a letter to his mother, "It is a long time since I did such work, and the conditions under which I did it were not altogether pleasant. We were in and out of all kinds of places, shifting valuables of one sort and another into the streets and helping the people to get away. Hundreds of Allied lorries assisted in the work of conveying the women and children from the burning city, and during part of the night I was helping to load these. It was a strange job. You should have seen me nursing little babies while their mothers were getting themselves settled." Now, the point when the wind changed, as I mentioned earlier, and it starts pushing towards the waterside, the fire began to force thousands of people ahead of it towards the docks, and where the Royal Navy in the harbour were also employed in helping and evacuating people right from the port side. And one British soldier wrote home to his wife, "British soldiers and British sailors are very tender-hearted as far as the women and children are concerned. I talked with the British commander of one small boat, and he told me that by that evening he would have given away the whole of the crew's 7 days' rations, all reserves of biscuits. He was afraid he might have to pay for this, but he did not care. He would not see the women and children starve." Now, contemporary documents also illuminate the wide range and variety of ways in which the British sought to save life and also provide help. For example, within hours of the fire breaking out, the British began preparing camps. This is a photograph inside one of them, to shelter and feed many of those who'd been left homeless from the fire, and they equipped it with tents, blankets, cooking utensils, stoves, latrines, medical staff. Over 6,000 men, women and children found temporary homes in these camps. And at the start, in fact, they were designed and laid out for 16,000. In the end, the French also took several thousand refugees. British bakeries produced and distributed vital supplies of bread because a great many bakeries had been destroyed in the fire. Aboard ships in the harbour, British sailors distilled seawater and pumped it ashore to be used for cooking and as drinking water. Ongoing care was taken over sanitation and water supplies, both in the camps and in the ruins of the city, where many people were still trying to eke out an existence, primarily so that disease would not break out. There were concerns about typhus in particular, typhus being a disease spread by body lice, particularly associated with populations crammed together in camps, but also waterborne diseases like typhoid and dysentery and so on. The British also supplied local hospitals in the city with ambulances, food, disinfectants, and various medical supplies. They also sent armed patrols into the city itself to prevent looting. Now, it was agreed, really as the fire was still burning, within about 12 hours of the fire breaking out, that the Allied armies in Thessaloniki would have responsibility for looking after the homeless population for about 6 weeks, and then they'd pass it over to the Greek authorities. Now, today, 6 weeks might not seem very long to us when we think about long-term humanitarian interventions by the international community in times of crisis, in wars, in disasters. But it should be remembered that both the British and the French armies were in Greece for military reasons, not relief purposes, and that they had very limited resources themselves. In fact, several British soldiers remember later that their own food supplies were cut down drastically, their rations were cut, so that the homeless could be fed. And it's also apparent from British documents of the time that the British were still feeding 3,000 people 6 months after the fire. In fact, many contemporary accounts, including Greek sources, which is important, suggest that the fire marked a turning point in relations between the British and the local population at this point of the war. Before the fire, many of the city's inhabitants had not really been very pleased to find themselves sharing their city with thousands of Allied soldiers. However, the energy and discipline shown by the British in their efforts to tackle the fire and their perceived compassion and efficiency when caring for those who'd been left homeless seemed to have had a strong and very favourable impact on public opinion, on local opinion. So about 10 days after the fire, a Greek journalist visited one of these British-run camps and wrote a newspaper report that provides some sense of this impression among the local population. So he describes how he turns up at the gate of the camp, and he shows his pass to the sunburned British soldier at the gate, and he's allowed to enter. And then he writes about moving in amongst the crowd and moving amongst the tents and the barracks. And he talks about the incessant buzz, as he puts it, that meets him, a buzzing of voices, crying children, the sight of piled up mattresses, chairs, bed frames. These are people's belongings that had been saved from the fire. And then he writes this. It's quite a long quote, but so far as I'm aware, it hasn't been translated into English before. In spite of the little time they had, despite everything, the energy of the English achieved the outcome of collecting humanely and housing and feeding a large number of refugees, and exceeded any expectation as far as assistance and care were concerned. They have provided food, abundant and nutritious food, prepared on site in clean and gleaming canteens, the latest English cuisine. He doesn't say, that seems to be unironic, that particular. And then nurses ensure that the food is good and plentiful. The English are particularly attentive to the children, he writes. They care for them better than mothers and grandmothers. They serve milk in abundance to the little ones and food of greater quality to the bigger ones. They are so attentive to the children that even their parents are amazed. Vouchers are used for the distribution of bread and food. Abundant water and baths are in order. Every morning, 2 British soldiers appear, one armed with a sprayer from which clouds of fennic acid escape. This is carbolic, which was a disinfectant, antiseptic, at least that's what they felt it was at that time. Finally, I reproduce for you the reminders that I saw displayed in the barracks in English, French, Greek and Hebrew, which seemed to me sufficient to understand the efforts made by the English to relieve the condition of the unfortunate. Meal times in the morning at 8 o'clock, coffee for adults, pastries for children. At 12 o'clock, meals for children. In the evening, at 6 o'clock, a dish for adults and children. Infants will be fed and washed daily at the following times: morning at 9 o'clock, afternoon at 3 o'clock, evening at 6 o'clock. An alarm call will announce the precise times of the meals. Baths for women are on Monday and Friday mornings, for men on Monday and Friday afternoons. Individuals wishing to leave the camp are required to return their blankets to the camp's director near the entrance. Now, before we get too carried away with that heroic humanitarian image, it's important to keep in mind that much of that apparent efficiency of the British response was rooted in a vital military need to avoid further chaos, really. The British had lost in the fire their headquarters and their headquarters buildings, their army post office, some medical stores, a few other buildings, but overall got off relatively lightly. These are 2 key areas, actually, which were lost, both British, taken by a British photographer. On the left, British headquarters. This is the headquarters for their entire campaign. And on the right, the Provost Marshal's office. But these pictures really remind us that the British were in Macedonia to fight a war. And to be able to do that properly, it was still essential to keep the city free of homeless families and free of disease, and keep its roads and its docks working effectively. It should also be noted, I think, and this is a rather delicate point, that this positive image was in marked contrast to how the soldiers of some other nations were perceived at the time, because there was very soon a popular belief that some other soldiers from other armies had behaved appallingly during the fire. It was said, for example, that some French drivers had demanded that refugees pay a fee for riding in their trucks to get away from the fire. There were rumours of French soldiers looting and selling off water and watches and sewing machines, and actually of 2 French soldiers being executed after they were being caught selling jewellery that they'd looted. Now, those allegations come from Greek reports, but you can find similar ones in British accounts too. For example, in the sound archive of the Imperial War Museum, about 50 years later, you can listen to Private Ernest Jones of the King's Own Shropshire Light Infantry describing his bemusement when he discovered that French soldiers, for reasons he couldn't fathom at all, had bayoneted holes in the hose pipe that he was using, and how later he was member of an armed patrol that stopped a group of French soldiers, including a French officer, trying to break into a bank. It's also important to remember how the efficiency of the British response, which was organised along military lines by experienced soldiers, by professional logisticians and professional medical personnel, might have been perceived by a population that was more familiar with the local response, the Greek response to refugees in the years running up to the fire. These are refugees from other parts of Greece and also from the battlefront. And the Greek journalist who I quoted a moment ago, who visited the British camp, ended his news story by saying that he left the camp very perplexed. And he explains this by asking the reader this: how have we spent astronomical sums for several years now without being able to accommodate refugees in a humane way? How, with few means and in a short time, have these people, the British, achieved results that have not been achieved here in many years? Now, I'm going to finish by talking about another British response to the fire, and that's the preservation of its memory in paintings and in photographs. And among these, I think, are some of the most dramatic images of the fire that you can find. So the painter of this picture was William Thomas Wood. Wood was a professional artist. He worked in both oils and watercolours. And he'd actually arrived in Thessaloniki as a soldier. So in fact, he'd arrived as a corporal in a balloon company, and his day job really was swinging in a basket underneath balloons, sketching enemy positions, the enemy lines. Now, eventually his skills as an artist from the sketches he was doing was recognised, and eventually he finished the war as an official British war artist. Now, in 1917, he made numerous sketches of the destruction and later produced several paintings on the theme of the fire, and this is one of them, as you can see. This is another. It seems that Wood made these from, it's likely that he wasn't in a plane, he didn't see this himself, that these were made from photographs after the fire. However, as I said, he was there on the ground as well, and did go through the ruins and did sketch what he saw, such as, and I'll show you 3 examples of that. So a little blurry, but it gives you an idea of what he was doing, but also adds some colour to the image with which we're perhaps more familiar. And that's a pencil sketch of the panorama, really. Now, Wood's images later illustrated a book called The Salonika Front, published in 1920, and his originals are now in the Imperial War Museum. But as well as Wood's paintings, British soldiers of the Royal Engineers, whose own normal jobs were mainly about mapping and surveying, were able to photograph the fire while it was still burning and take photographs of refugees, of firefighters, and then afterwards scenes of the destruction. I've shown you some of these images already that were taken by them, and here are a few more. So this was different to the shot I took earlier, but again, similar. This is the nighttime skyline on the first evening of the fire. This is just a few hours later, and a scene of refugees beginning to collect with their belongings just outside the city. Now, photographs weren't only taken at ground level. So on the afternoon of the 19th of August, 1917, which was the second day of the fire, a small British reconnaissance aircraft took off from an airfield outside Thessaloniki. These aircraft were usually reserved for observing the enemy from above. There were two men inside it. One was the pilot. It was a two-seater biplane, very delicate aircraft, of course, in those days. And aside from the pilot, there was a photographer sitting in the back seat, and his name was Sergeant Edwin Charles Bowery, who in civilian life had actually been a professional photographer. Now, for 25 minutes, they flew about 3,000 feet above the fire, at a height of 3,000 feet. And while Bowery, and you can see this, held this very heavy camera over the side and took photographs of what he could see. You can understand it's a heavy thing. These are glass photographic plates which he was having to do, and he exposed 18 on one flight and then went up again and exposed a further 18 on that occasion. Now later he recalled that they flew several times, this is one of his photographs, that they flew several times through these enormous columns of smoke, and that the heat was intense. In fact, in those days they had no radio communication, so he had to signal to the pilot in front that he wanted to go lower than 3,000 feet, and the pilot refused to do it. And when they were on the ground afterwards, the pilot explained that if they'd gone any lower, he was afraid that the aircraft would actually catch fire itself. And this photograph, if you can see it, so the White Tower is here, and the edge of the burnt area is round there. So you can see how close it got. Now, some of these photographs were later reproduced in a specially produced packet of 24 photographs. This was just a few weeks after the fire, and then sold to British soldiers as souvenirs. And they included not only these two aerial photographs, but also many of the photographs that I've shown you. And these are the photographs that John mentioned that are on display up in Thessaloniki at the exhibition at Miet. Now today, this is what they look like. There's 24 of them in a little paper packet entitled the Salonika Fire. Now today they help us, and I'll finish with this, they help us to understand, of course, as you'd expect, the scale and the impact of the fire. But in a small way, I think they also illustrate something else, and that's something of the concern, the genuine concern, I think, shown by many British soldiers for those whose homes had actually been destroyed. Because when the time came to sell these photographs, these packets, to its soldiers, and hundreds of these packs were sold, the British Army donated all of the money raised to a special fund, and that was a fund that had been set up deliberately to help the families who'd been left homeless by the fire. And I'll finish there. Thank you.